Every year, when I first heard the strains of Bing Crosby's White Christmas streaming from the tinny speakers of some African department store, with the temperature outside hovering around a mild 40 degrees Celsius, I groaned. Surely someone in these warmer climes could do better. It was Santa Mass, not Christmas, that was being celebrated, and it was just plain ridiculous to witness jolly old men strutting around in hot red suits and fake white hair. Although I should have been used to hearing the song after 7 such encounters in Africa, the first time each season always caught me off guard. However, it was the beginning of the summer holidays, and that in itself was reason enough to celebrate. Everyone was making the annual pilgrimage back to the land. Tendai was rummaging through the bins of the Tupula t-shirts, cast-offs from America mostly, with their sports franchise logos, their concert hall heroes, their current cartoon characters, and this year it was Aladdin, Jasmine, Monkey, and Flying Carpets, and their wildly inappropriate statements that would have seemed humorous in a San Diego mall, but meant nothing here in Francistown. It was a question of cheap and cheerful for her. The little brothers and sisters, nephews and cousins spoke little English and cared only that we cared enough to remember them at this festive time of year. This meant new shirts for them to play in, new shorts or dresses, flip-flops, and a soccer ball. The bread would come when we got to Harare, and the vegetables we would find at the market stalls in Mzarabani, just before we got to the Huata growth point, where the family lived. The crossing from Botswana side went well, but getting into Zimbabwe was a recurring nightmare. I always felt somewhat guilty about the microwave oven that would be sold soon as we reached Bulawayo for several times the amount that it was worth. Ahead of us was a long line of mostly women bearing similar contraband, all trying to convince the skeptical border guards that they were not trying to smuggle anything of value into the country, which is exactly what they were doing, so that they could generate sufficient funds to pay school fees for their many children. Neither did I feel good about the bulges in my pocket that were wads of black market money that we had earlier exchanged with the 3 hags, seemingly straight out of Macbeth, who sheltered under the cluster of trees at the Francistown turnoff. They alternately haggled and cursed those who were wanting to exchange their Botswana pula for Zimbabwe. The black market rates were very generous, and whereas I was tender-hearted and would a money changer whom she considered was trying to cheat her by offering her less than 4 times the rate, I left it to her. And the fact that the conversations took place in Shona, their native tongue, eased my conscience, as I had no clue as to what they were saying. The lines this year were particularly long, and after 4 hours of standing in the direct sunlight, I began to feel somewhat lightheaded. I did manage to enter the hall, produce the appropriate documentation, swear an oath that I was not trying to smuggle the car into the country, and then walk back to the vehicle and drive on to Bulawayo. However, I did not feel well. One of the great pleasures of driving north to see the family who lived in the Zambezi Valley, which bordered Zambia, was a visit to our friends Andrew and Lizina Banda in Bulawayo, in the suburb of Morningside. I had met them 5 years earlier during my visit to Botswana, and now Andrew was an instructor at the Teacher Training College in Francistown and commuted on weekends. As soon as I drove into their yard, I buckled at the knees and threw up, which had Andrew racing around the vehicle to lift me to my feet. Day 1 in Zimbabwe consisted of anxious phone calls, a cold water bath, bed rest, and nausea. It was not quite the way I'd planned to spend the day, with this generous and talented couple and their 2 adorable daughters. However, sunstroke can be fatal, and I was lucky to have survived relatively unscathed. Had I spent much more time out in the sun, my children might have been looking at a very grim future. Andrew helped Tendai dispose of the microwave, and a day later I was back in the driver's seat and ready for the next 700 kilometers. 15 kilometers short of Shangani, the fan belt broke. After gerrymandering a pair of Tendai's pantyhose into service, I was able to reach the village, but all the belts they had at the only garage were the wrong width. At the time, Zimbabwe had serious foreign currency restrictions and hence the raison d'etre for a flourishing black market. One of the consequences was that most garages outside the major city centres were not well stocked. The line of reasoning for accepting the wrong belt was that Gweru, the commercial heart of the Midlands, was close enough, but just in case we went to Spa to see if they had more pantyhose, they didn't. Again, we were with just enough luck to get us there, and the third garage in Gweru, we managed to find a proper fitting fan belt. We were able to move forward and at least reach Harare by late afternoon. However, the prospect of driving down the escarpment and through the bush to Huata after dark, where lions and elephants were commonplace, forced me to spend some of our precious cash on a hotel for the night in the city. All night long I fretted about the tent, the bedding, the clothes and the presents that were in the car in the outside parking lot. The security guard looked so ancient that thieves casing the parking lot would have been into their fifth car before he would have noticed anything amiss. As the sun rose, I hurriedly dressed and went to check for myself. All was well, except for the fact that I had spent a restless night that had me again wondering about my own sanity and the very idea of driving my wife, my 10-month-old daughter, and my 2-year-old son 900 kilometers in each direction just to deliver a bunch of used clothing and some money for seeds. Never again. We drove out of Harare northwards through the belt of magnificent farms that surrounded the city, stopping briefly to add fresh fruit and vegetables from the numerous farm and co-op stands. I loved to celebrate the richness of this land, which was so totally different from the semi-arid lands around Tonota. December is the beginning of the rainy season, and the green vegetation was bursting from the earth this year. Botswana, by contrast, was on the edge of the Kalahari, and it seemed to me every time I drove north, the desert had moved further down the highway, that the maize was drier, and there was less fertile land than there had been since the last time we had driven past. We drove through the huge citrus estates at the Mazoe turnoff and rose to the lush plateau around Centenary, where, in the distance, we could make out the dips and rises of the fast-flowing rivers that carved valleys and waterfalls on their hungry descent to join the mighty Zambezi River. The central dike, which was a storehouse of much of Zimbabwe's wealth, being a volcanic intrusion was rich in minerals and metals, and had its own special green covering of vegetation, quite unlike the darker hues of the forests and farms elsewhere. Quite suddenly, the world stops. Looking ahead, we could see the narrow, twisting road that hugged the edge of the escarpment. Lost in the heat haze out of our sight was Lake Cabora Bassa, the vast lake that had been formed by damming the Zambezi on the Mozambique side of the border. The land below is flat, fertile, and very humid. This was the very edge of the great tearing that ended with the Horn of Africa, where one day the continent will be split into two pieces. This is the reason for the Zambezi to be flowing into the Indian Ocean and no longer being swallowed up in the sands of the Kalahari. It was like standing at the base camp of Mount Everest. It always made me feel very small, ant-like, in fact, and human. I often wondered if we deserved to be considered stewards of all that we survey. I very much doubted it. I received a stiff affirmation of this last thought uh, a matter of minutes later, halfway down the long, steep descent to the plain below. In front of me, about 200 yards ahead, was a small herd of elephants, several of whom were anything but small. To make matters worse, the lead elephant's ears were flapping, which is never good news. Behind me was a very sharp bend, to my right a soft shoulder and an almost vertical drop-off, and to my left was a wall of jagged rocks that rose almost straight up to a height that could not be as properly ascertained as an overhang blocked the upper reaches of the slope from my field of vision. I had never tried a 180-degree turn on the side of a mountain before. The fact that I couldn't see out of the back windows, as the vehicle was piled to the roof with stuff, didn't help. I breathed deeply with 3 scenarios dancing through my brain. Being T-boned by the local bus as it tore down the mountain, rounding the bend at too great a speed to brake in time, toppling over the cliff behind us as I reversed, or being engaged by a massive bull elephant intent on protecting its family. I gingerly pulled several 30-degree shunts across the narrow road, then the engine shut off. The ignition failed me before, and it chose this moment to do so again. Sweat beaded on my brow. I swept my forearm across my face and felt the salt stinging my eyes as it trickled downwards to drip off my nose and chin. "Get out, Tendai, quickly!" I screamed. "Are you mad?" she screamed. She was holding Julia over her shoulder and looking at me with a growing sense of alarm. "You have to tell me if I'm driving in the middle of the road," I said with as much restraint as I could muster. "I'm going to have to roll backwards and put it in reverse. That should jumpstart it. Hurry." I failed to mention that I'd never tried this maneuver before, but several forward versions had accomplished the required effect in the past. She clambered out of the car with Richie also clasping her hand, and she hurried down the road towards the advancing elephants. Then when I judged she was far enough away, I took my foot off the brake, allowing the vehicle to roll backwards, alarmingly quickly. I jammed the gear into reverse and mercifully felt the engine sputter to life. Brake, clutch, first roar, the smell of an overheating gearbox, and then a forward motion. With my heart pounding, I threw open the door to let Tendai and the children back in. The little red Suzuki surged up the hill and kept going for the next several minutes until we came to a level piece of ground where we could safely park and watch the elephants as they emerged from the lower slopes. After waiting for what seemed an eternity, the small Mazda pit, put, 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 sputtered over the crest of the road and then on towards an urgent appointment somewhere to the south. The road was clear, but the descent was taken at a much gentler pace in case the elephants had decided to show themselves again.